Hey everybody, welcome back to Barter Hordes. My name is Robert, here with my weekly Friday reads. This is not the last Friday of the year, it's the penultimate Friday of the year, but I'm going to be on the road from the 26th through the 30th, and so I may not actually be able to film a Friday Reads video next week. It depends on how exhausted I am at the end of a long day of driving. If I'm not too tired, I'll film something from the hotel on the road. I am heading to Dallas, and I decided to drive instead of fly because I just can't imagine being around airport chaos at this time of the year. And so I'm taking a couple of days to drive to Dallas. I'm going to the Cotton Bowl game with Penn State, and then I'm driving back home again. That's my holiday plans. I don't have any Christmas plans, don't have any New Year's plans, so I'm just kind of squeezing a trip in between the two. So I may see you between now and the end of the year. I might see you with a couple of short videos that I'll film this week and schedule for that week. I plan to do my best reads of 2019 video like I did last year. I plan to do a reading goals or reading plans video for 2020. And I'm 10 days away from the second anniversary for this channel. I actually started right at New Year's 2 years ago. So I'll have some kind of a short video, maybe a call for question and answers or something for that occasion. So you will see me between now and the end of the year, but it may not exactly be on Friday Reads. This has been a really good week for my reading. I finished 4 books, and I'm in the middle of 3 more. It's kind of been my week, coincidentally, for books about Russia or the Soviet Union. The first book I finished, I mentioned last week, was an audiobook of a young adult historical title called Symphony for the City of the Dead, Shostakovich and the Siege of Leningrad by M.T. Anderson. And I finished that one, and it was terrific. My only complaint, as I mentioned last week, is that I would have liked even more musical excerpts in the audiobook itself. They do include some, and there are a few more towards the end than there are in the beginning, but I would have been happy with even more. And I'll talk more about Shostakovich's 7th Symphony when we get to my special projects part of this video. But that was terrific. So if you're interested in World War II history, if you're interested in classical music, if you're interested in something that combines the two of them really well, give this one a chance and maybe even consider the audio. The author reads it. He does a great job, but it's also really interesting because of the musical excerpts that they include. The second book that I finished was, what did I finish? Oh, the 5th book in the Louise Penny Chief Inspector Gamache series, The Brutal Telling. Some people haven't liked this one. I read a review of it just today on Instagram that the person really disliked this one. But I found it fascinating. I have liked them more and more as I get into the series because the individual characters that make up the village of Three Pines in Quebec are becoming more and more real people. And so their backstories filter into each of the new novels. And the best thing about this series for me is that there are 15 of them already out, and I've just finished 5, and I'm doing one a month. So I have roughly another year before I get to the end of the 15th one, and who knows, by then she might have written another one. So I'm really enjoying that series, and that's all Sarah's fault at Hardcover Hearts. She's the one who turned me on to Louise Penny's books. The next one that I finished was nonfiction. I hesitate to call it a memoir because it's not really a memoir. It's called 5 Days Gone here in the United States. I think it's on Chapel Sands in the UK. It's a book set in the UK by Lara Cumming. And Cumming is trying to piece together her mother's story. Her mother was adopted at age 3, although she was not told for a long, long time. And then almost immediately after she was adopted, or right before she was adopted legally, she was kidnapped for 5 days. And so the book is being marketed as this grand mystery, true crime. One of the quotes on the back says it reads like a thriller. It doesn't. I didn't really care for this book because it's a lot of book about a very little story. There's not a whole lot of details that anybody really knows about this story, about her mother's life. But the author's turning it into this grand exploration. The author's an art critic, which explains a lot of what goes on in the book. She talks about a lot of paintings. She talks about a handful of photographs and then spends a great deal of time speculating wildly about what the people in the photographs must have been thinking at that moment, even though some of them she's never met. I didn't really like the fact that so much of this is just wild speculation, and she had a very clear bias against her grandfather. She's perfectly welcome to dislike her grandfather, but she's based it on some things that she herself admits weren't true, that she found out later weren't true. And she doesn't spend a lot of time going back and chastising herself for her early biases. She just continues on with them. So I was a little annoyed at how much of this book was just wild speculation as opposed to how much of it was based on actual facts and historical documents and people's narratives. She does include some of that, but even the people involved in the narrative have wildly differing accounts of how things happened and who did what to whom. What I found truly amazing is that the author's mother, the woman at the heart of this story, seems to be the only one in this community who didn't know the whole story. And so it's not really much of a mystery. It was just a mystery to her. I think my opinion is probably a very unpopular one on this one. I think most people have praised this book and have loved this book, but I found it just filled with glaring logical holes that I didn't need an art critic's interpretation of a bunch of classic paintings to somehow give a more resonant meaning to the lack of story surrounding this so-called thriller mystery as it's being marketed. I think this book suffers from really overhyped marketing that is not accurate. And so for me, it was a big disappointment because of that. It's not a very long book, but it felt like a long book reading it. So that was my only bad experience of the week. My best experience of the week was the one I finished just yesterday, and that's Lara Prescott's debut novel, The Secrets We Kept. It's published by Knopf. This one was getting a lot of buzz at Book Expo when I was there in the summer. I did get a advanced reader's copy of this one, but I didn't get around to reading it until an actual finished copy of it arrived just a week or two ago. And I thought, I've got to read that. That way I can put the advanced reader's copy into the little free library that my community just started 2 weeks ago. And if you don't know the story, it's a pretty complicated historical event that she is using as the basis for this novel. But she makes it very clear, which I think is remarkable for a debut novel. There's an Eastern story, there's a Western story. The Eastern story is about the writing, the finishing of Boris Pasternak's famous novel, Dr. Zhivago, which the Soviet Union was not going to allow to be published. And so it's the story of how it ends up getting published. It's also the story of Boris Pasternak's lover, who becomes, in some ways, his unofficial agent as well, and the dangers that puts her and her family in, as well as the dangers it puts Pasternak in. On the Western side of the story, it's about a group of women, many of whom were involved in various positions of importance in World War II, but now that we're at the beginning of the Cold War, they have been kind of relegated to the typing pool because the men are back, that kind of thing, that kind of nonsense. But some of them are actually recruited out of the typing pool of the agency, which is the early CIA, when it was still in Washington, D.C., rather than at Langley Air Force Base. Is it Air Force Base? I forget. I think it is. And a couple of them are recruited to become actual agents while they're supposedly members of the typists pool. And it's the story of the CIA's efforts to get a copy of the Dr. Zhivago book to use as propaganda to get printed and put back in the hands of Russians as a way of embarrassing the Soviet Union. And so their involvement in Operation Zhivago or whatever, Mission Zhivago, whatever it was, is a simultaneous story to the Eastern story about Pasternak and the writing of the book. And I just really enjoyed it. It's not the kind of suspenseful thriller that you're constantly worried somebody's about to die or somebody's about to get, killed in front of you. It's not that kind of shoot 'em up espionage story. It's more of an intellectual espionage story and the way these different characters have to read each other. And I just found that really interesting. And I was very impressed for a debut novel. I'm not sure I could have kept such a complicated storyline straight in the hands of an incompetent author. Prescott does a terrific job, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing what she does next. The thing I remember from Book Expo is there were 5 or 6 young women, probably late 20s, early 30s, dressed in vintage clothing, walking around. There were a lot of moving advertisements at Book Expo. And at first I thought they might have been there for Fiona Davis's The Chelsea Girls, but it turns out they were actually there for Lara Prescott's book, The Secrets We Kept. And I just kept remembering that when I picked up my advanced reader's copy. And so I think a lot of the advance notice and the hype about this one is pretty well deserved. It was picked up by Reese for Reese Witherspoon's book club, which got it a lot of notice too. But I really enjoyed it, and I don't read a lot of espionage novels, and so that was a nice twist for me. The 3 books that I have on the go now, the first of them is my next book in my backlist project, and that is Ann Tyler's, I want to say 1986, but I might be wrong about the date, her 1980s book, The Accidental Tourist. Now, I have read this before, and I have seen the movie. I think it's William Hurt and Gina Davis. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's right. And it's, of the 5 or 6 or 7 Ann Tyler books that I have read in the past, this one is my clear favorite. I just find this one completely captivating. It's a very simple story. I'll talk about it more after I finish it, but I am enjoying rereading that one after so many years. The second book that I picked up continues with my USSR, how many S's did I put in there? Probably too many. My Soviet Union reading week, and this is Midnight in Chernobyl by Adam Higginbotham, which of course is about the 1986 disaster at the nuclear plant right outside of Chernobyl, which is now considered part of Ukraine. It's just, I think it's just north of Kiev, probably an hour or so, maybe 2 hours from Kiev. And at the time, of course, it was a Soviet state. And so it's about the disaster at nuclear reactor number 4, the brand new one of the 4 at that plant, and how it was just so mismanaged at every turn by the people involved, and how the Soviet immediate need to talk everyone down that there's no problem, the cover-up mentality added to the disaster that became what we now just call Chernobyl. I'm also I started the HBO miniseries on Chernobyl. There's 5 episodes to that. And I watched the first one last night. It skips over quite a bit of the beginning of the book, Midnight in Chernobyl. I don't think it's based strictly on this book. But it's interesting to recognize some names. And I am just absolutely dumbfounded how Higginbotham can take a topic as complicated as what goes on inside a nuclear reactor and blend that with the history of hundreds of fairly difficult to remember Russian names for the readers and keep it all clear for us. I'm 150 pages in, and it's riveting. It's like reading a suspense thriller. So if you're at all interested in the science or the history of that particular disaster, read this particular book. I'm almost positive this is going to be one of the ones that is in contention next year for the nonfiction BookTube Prize. It's just so well done, and a lot of people have been talking about it. So I'd be surprised if people don't consider that one of the 48 in the field. And then the third one that I just started last night, it's a very brief novel by Jacqueline Woodson, her new one, Red at the Bone. I did read her previous novel for adults, Another Brooklyn, and absolutely thought it was amazing. And so I was really looking forward to this one, and I'm only a quarter of the way into it, but it reads so quickly that I'll finish it within a couple of days. And so far, so good. Woodson is just a masterful storyteller, and so I'm really looking forward to that. So that's what I finished. That's what I've started. An update on my 3 projects. I did watch one more movie on the movies project from the AFI list of 100, and that was the 1979 Francis Ford Coppola film, Apocalypse Now. I mentioned to you last week that I've seen this several times before, but it's been many years since I've seen it the last time. And so it was not new to me, but it was new enough that it was really fascinating to watch. I can't say I loved the movie. I've never been a huge fan of it, but it is certainly impressive. The cinematography is absolutely spectacular. The music is terrible. Note to self, if I ever make a movie, don't use contemporary synthesized soundtracks. They don't date well. Had this been a classical music soundtrack, even with some fairly avant-garde music, it would have held up so much better, my personal opinion. But the thing that makes this movie so interesting for me is it's based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness that I know so well. I've taught this book, I don't know, a dozen times. I've read it probably a dozen more. And seeing all the different parallels that Coppola puts in from the book, even though the storyline has changed from going up the Belgian Congo during colonial times to going up this river in Vietnam towards Cambodia to get a renegade colonel who's gone native, as they say. The Russian Harlequin, the attack on the boat with the arrows, the woman standing there just kind of looking at Kurtz after, he's being taken away, or in the movie's case, after he's been killed. There's so many parallels that are just brilliant in this movie that it is impressive, even though I can't really say I love it. The next one up for me in that sequence is the 1933 Marx Brothers film, Duck Soup, a political satire. So I'll be getting to that one sometime during the next few days. The backlist title project I mentioned, I'm reading Ann Tyler's The Accidental Tourist now. Next up for me is a book that I haven't read before, and that's E.L. Doctorow's Billy Bathgate. This is set in 1930s New York, and that's about all I know about it. It's actually kind of hard to get a copy of this one new in the United States without spending a fortune. So I ended up ordering a copy from Book Depository in the UK because they still have the Penguin edition of it available for a reasonable price. So it's going to take several weeks for that one to get to me. I may not actually get to read that one until January sometime. And then on the music project, this is the first week that I've cheated. I've been just using a random number generator to choose what works I've listened to. And I listened to 10 works, I think it was, this week. So I've been busy listening to music. But I did force into that sequence Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, since it goes along, of course, with the Symphony for the City of the Dead. It's a long work. It's nearly 80 minutes long. So it's an investment of time if you're going to listen to this one. And I have probably 3 or 4 different recordings, all of which I think are really good. But the recording I'm featuring here, and the one I included in the playlist for this project that's linked below, is a 2017 live recording from the Boston Symphony Orchestra at Symphony Hall in Boston. And I just thought it was really interesting to hear a live recording as I was listening to them talk about its premiere in different cities around the world. It was really a fascinating kind of tie-in. I don't think it's my favorite Shostakovich symphony, but it's one of the 3 that I would recommend that you attack if you're going to listen to his music. It is, however, nearly 80 minutes long, so you might want to break it up and listen to one movement at a time if you don't have an hour and a half to devote to this piece. So that's my update for the week. a good reading week, a decent movie week, a fantastic music week. Ready to go into this next week. I am leaving on the 26th. I'll be back on the 30th, late on the 30th, and go from there. Happy holidays to everybody. If you're celebrating Christmas, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, whatever you celebrate. I don't particularly celebrate any of them. It's kind of a lonely time of the year. But at the same time, I do like the holiday spirit. New Year's is a nice thing to celebrate. And the winter solstice is coming up, I think, tomorrow or the next day. So I'm all here for that. Let's start to see the days get a little bit longer again. Have a good weekend, everybody, and I'll talk to you at some point during the next week. Bye, everybody.